3. Track A, VPN architectures, looking at the complete picture.
Thank you, everyone. I thought we'd take maybe just a few minute coffee break and let the back of the room fill up. No, I guess the room's a little large. It'd probably take a little while for them to round up enough people and pay them enough money to come in here and listen to a talk about VPN. The talk that I have for you today is, as my bio and the abstract states in the materials that you've been handed out, that have been handed to you. This is more of the what and a little bit of the how. If we wanted to really get into the how, we'd be talking about maybe the cryptanalysis of different types of ciphers and things like that, and that gets a little bit beyond me because my discrete math teacher didn't speak very good English. But let's break into this stuff. VPNs, how many people in this room are using VPNs today? I hope most of you. And some that have never used it before? There probably will be a few. Just generally speaking, VPN has a few different uses. Remote user VPN is typically used for road warriors and teleworkers. Most of you guys know this stuff because they print this in articles in journals about every week. Branch Office Vpn is the other type of VPN. The reason that I like to bring this up in the beginning is just because the way that you might implement, select, or the criteria that you might use to select or implement a VPN are going to depend on how you intend to use it. So company-owned VPN, subsidiary companies, that's another common use of VPN. Typically, this is actually blended into what's called extranet now. And the way that usually looks is you have one remote user. It almost looks like remote user VPN. The difference is that the company hosting the network and hosting the VPN doesn't own the laptop or the box of the remote user. So here's just a couple pictures. By the way, don't worry, I've got a lot of material here, so I'm going to just try to blaze through most of this, and hopefully it's not too much repetition for those of you that read this in the journals every week. Most likely you have a remote user with an analog modem connected to the internet. They're going to use a tunnel back to the corporate network and access their mail server, etc. Branch Office VPN looks a little bit different. It looks more like two routers connected by frame relay. The difference is that people think they can use the internet for free, so they turn up a VPN between these two boxes. Traffic volume, you want to probably consider how many simultaneous connections you're going to need. This is really just part of the requirements that you would consider as a system or network admin when you're going to implement a VPN. What kind of load are you expecting to have on your box? I have got some graphs later on in the presentation also that talk about load actually on your internet egress. We'll cover that as well. That's basically your throughput requirement. And you want to consider where your bottlenecks are going to be. So for example, some of the older VPN boxes were limited to, for example, 8 simultaneous connections. Probably not very useful. Fortunately, those have gone away and been replaced by boxes that claim to be unlimited. This is a slide which could easily represent your internet egress. And what you want to do is probably talk to your ISP if you don't run your own router and try to get some idea as to what your current utilization is. This graph really isn't very accurate because I made all the numbers up. But if, for example, you had a lot of peaks during the day and you had a T1 here, you'd be peaking out at your T1 throughput there. So you can expect then latency to increase, which is going to affect VPN. And you would also expect then that you might lose some packets. And if any of you are familiar with some of the earlier crypto schemes that were used for securing VPN tunnels, any kind of packet loss at all could result in magnification of packet loss as a result of the compression methods that were used. So the first step in really considering your requirements, or one of the first early things that you should be looking at, is what your current egress looks like and whether it's sufficient to support your expected capability or your expected requirements. This is a slide which just briefly demonstrates the fact that when you have an application that's dependent upon, well basically, the higher the layer you implement your VPN, then the application dependence increases. And the reason the line is pretty flat between layer 2 and layer 3 is because most applications make function calls into the stack and open up TCP connections way above layer 3, so it doesn't matter. So whatever you implement in terms of VPN, routing, encapsulation, or tunneling, or any of those types of routing concepts or routing technologies, they're all done below where your application sits. You don't have to worry about it. When you get into the higher layer VPN solutions, there are some SOC solutions, for example, you do run into greater application dependence. And typically what we find in this area is that there are some benefits, by the way, to using a VPN at layer 5, for example. Some of those benefits include you can look at unidirectional packet flows. It's something that you can implicitly do using packet filters, but there are reasons why you would want to use a VPN at that layer. Another good reason, which I think is really the best, is in the case of extranet users. When you have laptops that you don't own and you're going to ask your business partner to ask their employees to install a client that's going to modify their stack that might affect how they support the laptop or how they support the machine, you're probably going to get some pushback from their network admins. So using a higher layer solution, typically there's a little bit less breakage that occurs in the networking stack on the client side. But again, your application dependence increases. So for example, in the case of, I believe it was Exchange or something like that, which made some call outside of the normal routines, like it used a Berkeley call instead of a WinSock call or something like that, and the company that had this particular VPN solution couldn't deal with that. So just another example of application layer dependence. There are some things you would want to consider from a management perspective. Are you all familiar with the AAA routine, the AAA concepts, authorization, it's authorization, accounting, and authentication. So there is a difference between devices that implement something like a AAA type scheme and those that you have to run your database of users on the device, which means that if you're running a network operating system and you have a slate of users that you like to give access to for VPN, and you have to recreate that list of users over here, well, that's obviously going to affect how you manage the VPN solution. So it's not much of a solution in that case. Integration with existing platforms, and that's really what I was referring to when you talk about integrating your authentication scheme. If you can use Radius, for example, then you might be able to hook into your back-end network operating system for authentication purposes. Another thing that I find is really severely lacking in VPN gear in general, with respect to this AAA schema, is that while you may be able to authenticate the user using some database, even if it's replicated, or using Radius pass-through or whatever the mechanism might be, you may not be able to actually authorize them to use specific resources. And in some cases, particularly the VPNs that were around maybe 6 or 9 months ago, the authentication, you would expect that authentication would work through the tunnel. Not always the case. And so in cases where the authentication through the tunnel didn't work, in other words, you didn't have a complete open pipe once you were authenticated, there were some limitations in the way that packets could be routed. In those types of cases, then what you would run into is you couldn't authenticate to your back-end network operating system transparently, quote unquote. So what we need to do is look to VPN devices to be able to not only authorize the users but also authenticate them for specific granular resources behind on the corporate net. Availability is a large concern, and obviously we probably don't need to run down the entire list of things that you would want to consider from an availability perspective, but just with any network device, if it's providing all of your remote access and you have no out-of-band backup via modems or whatnot, that's part of the reason why some people consider putting in VPNs to begin with, then in fact you're going to want to consider redundancy and other load sharing, load balancing types of schemas. One of the other things that would be very useful for vendors to consider is providing better integration with things like OpenView and probably not Cisco Work, since they're pretty much proprietary for Cisco gear, but management platforms like that, I guess Spectrum is another one. If vendors probably took a more modular approach to the way that they implemented their VPN gear, then I think users would have a much easier time implementing it into their existing environments and actually managing it. Some vendors don't even know what a MIB is. Others provide generic traps but aren't MIB compliant, and I think someone is working on some drafts for MIBs that would specifically help VPN, in particular the IPsec MIB and so forth. Some use proprietary management protocols, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I would favor a proprietary management protocol before I would work with nothing or work with a simple log for which I had to have access to the device. It takes, if I had to go to every router in the entire networked environment just to see what the log looked like, imagine what that would look like from a management perspective on a larger scale. This is an example of just a picture of where you might find your network management system. Clearly it's going to be on one end of this tunneled network, and if you're using a branch Office VPN, hopefully this route would actually take you through the tunnel. But the question is how are you actually managing getting this data back to your management station, and what does the network look like? And in particular, in this part of the network over here near this clear text box, what does that look like? It's something that you need to consider whenever you're doing firewall management or management of any device that involves the perimeter of your network. Talking again or continuing the discussion really on requirements, we have to worry about whether we can do the entire slate of applications that we intend to do. Many of us have systems that are implemented that aren't very well documented, at least I do. And sometimes you don't know what the actual requirements are, so you have to pilot a system in order to determine whether it will pass all of your protocols. Some vendors claim to be multi-protocol, and some of them work and some of them don't, so you really need to pay careful attention to what your actual networking requirements are. With respect to different physical networks, this is an interesting point because there are some very, very good VPN devices out there that are appliance type, or sort of what I call black box hardware devices, but you know, they run Ethernet. So the question is, how do you deal with alternate physical network topologies? And in that case, what you probably end up doing is looking at a software solution that installs onto a box with an OS for which there are cards supported that plug into that physical topology. So we have different types of VPN boxes, hardware, software, encrypting routers, and firewalls. And I think that it's important to draw the distinction between these different classes because each one carries with it some certain set of limitations as well as a set of advantages, and we're going to discuss a couple of those just now. Here's one architecture to consider. You put the VPN box, whether it's a host operating system running some software behind your firewall, and keep it nicely protected. Clearly, you know, if this is a dedicated box, you wouldn't want to have superfluous services running on it. You would cut out everything you don't need. But even in the case of a black box type of thing, you might want to stick it behind your firewall. And one of the things that this gives you the ability to do is at least log incoming VPN packets, because you know if they're headed towards that VPN device and they're of a certain IP protocol number or on a certain port, for example, that they would be associated with the VPN, at least hopefully. So that's one thing to consider. There are some disadvantages to that, but we'll talk about that in a second. This is really just flip-flopped. Take your VPN device and put it on your DMZ. Hopefully you're using a screening router. And again, you can kind of accomplish some of the same things in this architecture or this network design as you would in the other. I think the advantage here, though, is that you firewall people are probably thinking, hey, great, now my firewall can inspect all my packets once they're decrypted. So now I know what's actually coming in, what actual user protocols are coming in, what applications are being used. This might be very useful. There might be some other problems with this architecture, however, and we've got a couple of others to look at. This is kind of one of my favorites, although it's kind of complex, and it does introduce some sort of burdens on your firewall. If you don't have a pretty beefy firewall here and you're running, you know, DS3 or something like that, you could have some problems here. Most people with that type of architecture can afford to do something a little bit better than this. But this is nice for a firewall that has multiple interfaces. Some firewalls only have 2, 3 interfaces, and you might not be able to do this. But what this gives you the ability to do is actually packet filter and protect your VPN box. And then once those data are decrypted, then you can again inspect, analyze, log, and trigger alarms based on your existing firewall policy, which is kind of nice. Most firewalls that have 4 interfaces are flexible enough that you can configure them to use, you can change the policy in here at will without affecting the rest of your topology. So it's kind of a nice architecture. But again, you know, you have to consider the availability aspect of this. If the firewall goes down, not only do you not have internet egress, which probably would implicitly do away with any VPN that you have anyway, but you certainly wouldn't have VPN either. Some people may use, actually this is interesting point. There are actually good load balancing and load sharing programs that you can use for firewalls, and there aren't as many that you can use for VPN devices. So if your VPN requirement is high availability, then maybe you can use a load balancing or load sharing situation with this type of topology and actually achieve better uptime and some fairly good redundancy that you wouldn't be able to get using discrete devices that aren't connected in this manner. And of course you have firewall integrated VPN devices, and you know, network address translation, how many of us are doing that? RFC 1918, your best friend, because everyone ran out of IP numbers and IANA won't give you any more. Actually, VPN servers and firewalls solve a lot of problems with network address translation because you don't have to worry about if the internal network here, like labeled E1, if that subnet is private, your firewall's already doing the translation for you for most of your other incoming and outgoing traffic. Well, with respect to the VPN, you terminate your VPN at your firewall, and the firewall then can then handle dumping that user back out onto the, or even a group of users from a branch Office VPN, back out onto the internal LAN. And again, you would probably have the capability in this type of situation to do some packet filtering and other types of firewalling with this type of architecture, even if you were using branch Office VPN. Most firewalls have been around for a while, and firewalls that do any kind of authentication, which is most, whether that's for outgoing traffic or incoming traffic, have already implemented things like Radius, have already implemented things like Ldap, and can already interface with your back-end network operating system. A little bit of flexibility there. I don't know if these arrows are probably pretty hard to see, and they're really not that important. It's just trying to depict where the decrypted traffic is, and this is just a picture of a VPN box used as a host protector. So up there's a little arrow drawn from the VPN box up to the little server up there. That could be an accounting server, an HR server, something like that. And one of the things that limits how well you can secure parts of your network that need extra security, like HR or accounting or things like that, is to physically locate the server next to the people. Well, that's not always possible. One way you might be able to accomplish similar security is to use a VPN internally, allowing your HR and accountants and so forth that are working in another country perhaps to install a VPN client, hook up and connect and establish a VPN connection to this box, which is protecting their server. So it's kind of a nice idea. And VPN devices are coming down in price. It's a fairly competitive market. I don't know if anyone in here is a VPN vendor, but very competitive market. So the prices are coming down, and this makes this type of situation practical and feasible, something that probably wasn't so true a couple years ago when we first started running VPNs. Again, this is the physical transport issue. You're probably going to be using some sort of NT or Solaris or Linux or something like that that'll support NICs that work on different physical topologies here. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen a hardware device that does different token ring or something, but I'd like to know if they do. Back to network address translation real quickly. In this slide, I understand that you're way far back there and it's hard to see, and if you've had a couple beers, it's even harder. But down here, what I did is I kind of shaded the packets, the fields in the packets that might be interesting to you. For example, on the top, this is an incoming connection to the VPN device. And this is simulating what would happen if the VPN device were located somewhere behind the firewall, not on the firewall itself. And I'm assuming everyone here is going to use a firewall, because that's a given. So in fact, what happens is that the destination address is going to change. So in the yellow over there, I've highlighted the integrity check, which might exist depending on what type of depending on whether you're using Ipsec, there's a little Freudian slip, because Ipsec uses a lot of integrity checks, or if you're using some other type of VPN protocol that does do integrity checks. The firewall, which actually, or the NAT device, the NAT gateway, whichever one it might be, which does this translation, is probably not going to muck with the integrity unless it's involved in the scheme, which today is probably not so likely. In the future, I would hope that it would actually, that we could use things like Ipsec in transport mode and so forth. But today, typically what we're finding is very discrete VPN deployments. So in this case, this is going to break your integrity check. So whether that breaks the VPN or not is open to debate. I've seen vendors who take a protocol like an Ipsec and they bend it, at least that's what I call it, they bend it for NAT. So because they've got a lot of customers banging at their door saying, hey, I don't have a whole unlimited range of IP addresses, I need some mechanism for getting my packets into my network and back out of my network, even on a tunnel. And so they might tweak and fudge that part of their protocol or their implementation of the protocol if they've got a NATed environment. On an outgoing connection, I think that this becomes a little bit more difficult. You have a packet here with a source address, which is on a NATed network, of course, RFC 1918 compliant, destination address, and then, of course, when that NAT gateway gets its dirty little fingers on it, turns it into something globally unique, which is great. Changes the port, too. So notice on the incoming, the difference is that you may not have to change the port because the port is actually, well, it may change the source port, but it probably doesn't need to. Because, again, sorry to revert back so quickly without really finishing this one, but back up here, the source address and source port can stay the same because that, in fact, gives you the route from the destination host back out to the internet. But in the second case, you must change that source port. So This can be problematic, and I've got an example later on in a slide later on where I talk very briefly about what might work and what doesn't work, and we certainly know that, that IKE doesn't work. So IKE will break, and you can't use IPsec with IKE. You might be able to use IPsec with pre-shared keys, depending on how that's set up. So with respect to network address translation, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I spent a couple minutes on this and a couple slides because everyone always asks me questions about NAT, and I can barely answer them because there's so many different variations on how people do VPN. But things that I think would work are firewall integrated VPN. Of course, the reason is that the firewall is basically bridging the two networks, the trusted network and the untrusted network. And so it can provide all the translation directly after it verifies the integrity on the packet, etc. A VPN gateway with interfaces on both nets. I don't even think I showed you an architecture like that, but certainly you could picture that, where the VPN box is in parallel with a firewall. So that's also another architecture to consider, and in fact, most of the deployments that I've played a role in actually use that just because it happens to work and it's fairly easy to do. And also, as a consultant, I used to just play more a role in the design and piloting of a project than I would in the actual deployment. So many of the ones that I dealt with deployed VPN in that way. It's got some security problems, namely that VPN devices don't generally ship with the same kinds of logging and auditing capabilities as you would find in a firewall, since that's what firewalls were designed to do. And so you end up with this other device sitting on your corporate network on the edge, bridging your trusted network to your untrusted internet network. And of course, it doesn't do very good logging, so not very good for you as a firewall administrator, security person, or whatnot. Again, IPsec using ESP encryption without the integrity check and pre-shared keys may work in certain NAT situations. This is probably, I'm not an RFC buff, I didn't write it, I read it, but it's hard to understand sometimes. I think this would work, but it depends on the implementation. That's what I'm trying to say. So if you really need to do IPsec, you can't terminate it at the interface between the shared or the trusted and the untrusted network, then you probably need to do some testing. On Pptp, I almost hate to be saying that up here, but it does work. A lot of people use it because it's on like 90% of the laptops out there because people are running Windows. So people use it, and it actually can go through NAT. It doesn't care because it's all wrapped up inside of a GRE type packet, and it doesn't matter. So it does work. You still have to have a route from the NATed environment back out to the internet and so forth, but it does work. I talked about bent implementations. I kind of like that because vendors never really tell you what they've done. They just kind of say, well, it kind of works, so give it a try. From a performance standpoint, you want to consider what your throughput's going to be. And this kind of goes back to looking at your internet egress utilization and determining whether or not you can meet your own requirements for networking. And your users, if you're looking at this from a systems admin or a network admin perspective, the users are going to be the ones that cry the loudest. So if you displease them by giving them a solution that's extremely slow, chances are A, they're not going to use it, and B, you're going to hear a lot of flack. So consequently, I think that would be a failure. So you need to look at what the throughput is. Now, vendors are very good about publishing throughputs because everyone asks for it, but what they rarely do is publish the packet size at which the throughput was measured. So here you go. Here I can do T1, encrypted T1 with integrity check. That's wonderful, great. What packet size we're using? Oh, 1024-byte packets, that's wonderful. So if all my users go out there and FTP their mail, then we're set. But if they do anything else, like drag and drop, move files across SMB shares or whatnot, or they do regular other types of mail, like exchange mail or even POP mail, even character-based applications. Heck, if you're using Telnet or something like that over VPN, the vendor gives you this T1 throughput at 1024-byte packets. I can guarantee your packets aren't going to be 1024 bytes when you're using Telnet. So you need to consider what numbers they're giving you there, and I would say if you have any concerns, do your own tests. You can at least test this empirically. You don't have to have a smart bits or some other elaborate kind of testing scheme. The application fingerprint is also important. I kind of mentioned this. FTP versus drag and drop, they have very different application footprints. You can use test suites like Ganymede Chariot if you're looking at testing this on a large scale, if you have a very large deployment. If it's not such a large deployment, again, I would use some sort of empirical testing. But you can also do like a Gedunken experiment. You can think about this. You don't have to necessarily go out and plug in the hardware and test it, because that takes time as it is. So you can't just think about what kinds of applications my users are doing, what kind will they do when they're remote, or from a branch office. If you've got a branch office and all of your servers are hosted locally, that's pretty easy to figure out what they're going to be doing. But I would give some consideration to those requirements. This is just briefly a little graph of what throughput might look like on a typical network device. Just kind of showing you sort of like, once you get up to very large packets, of course, you get fragmentation and things slow down considerably. This isn't, I would say, an ideal graph. Ideally, you'd have packets being forwarded and encrypted and so forth, and forwarded at a very, very fast rate. So this would not necessarily be a very acceptable throughput graph for a particular device. If your requirements are to do drag and drop and mail and telnet and things like that, and you're running over a pipe that is already congested, and this is the kind of throughput they give you with 64-byte packets, you might want to take a second look at that, or ask the vendor to cough up some more test data that might, hopefully it's not the stuff that they publish in the marketing collateral, because that's skewed. And latency is one of the things that you certainly have to worry about in a VPN. I mentioned earlier that if you're familiar with the earlier versions of Pptp, for example, they used a stateful compression and actually a stateful encryption. I don't know about the stateful compression. They used a stateful encryption scheme. So what would happen is that if you lost one packet, that might contain half of the data that you would need on the other end to decrypt both of them. So unfortunately, what that means is that if you lose one of those packets, you lose both of them. So of course, if it's a 1-to-2 type of ratio, then for every one packet you lose, you've now doubled your loss. So gee, well, 1% packet loss, okay. I can handle 1 or 2% packet loss. This is the internet. I don't own it. I'm not paying for it, except for my egress. I'm not paying for the transit. So I can handle 1 to 2%. But what if that's 2 to 4%? Or what if it's 3 and it goes to 6? Well, I would venture to say that your VPN solution is probably not going to be quick enough and robust enough to deal with that nicely. So that's just another thing to consider. RFC 2544, for those of you who might be interested, is Bradner's work on how to do throughput testing on network devices and packet loss and latency and so forth. And that's a good reference if you're interested in looking at that more closely. And it gives you a little bit of ammunition when you go up against the vendors and ask them really tough questions. Get them to put their engineers on the phone for you. Mean time between failures, this is like, I don't know, a statistic that everyone uses, so it'll probably be somewhere in the literature that you look at for the vendors of interest. It's a good place to start, but if you don't use VPN devices in volume, like MTBF is based on statistics. So if you're using one VPN device, MTBF doesn't really mean much to you. Now, if you have like 100 or 200, then it might mean something. But in general, I've gotten VPN devices shipped to me direct from vendors for evaluation purposes. I plug it in, I go through everything, it doesn't work. Okay, what do? You call them up and say, gee, this device you sent me doesn't work. They say, what? Come on, you've got to try this and this and this. Okay, so I tried this and this and that. Well, it still didn't work. So they take it back, they send me another one. That one didn't work either. They thought I was nuts. They thought I didn't know what I was doing. So they sent an engineer out to my site, help me out, because I was stupid. Well, it didn't work. So 2 devices in a row from a hardware company, not a very good sign. Anyway, meantime between failures, if you get a fluke, if you get one of either a fluke or one of a batch that just didn't come out right and missed the QA, it's not going to work. Hopefully it's failing up front, though, instead of at the end or when it's in production. Look at the guts of the system. I've seen some VPN devices. Software is different here. If you're running this on a network operating system, then you might be able to use mechanisms on the underlying OS to help improve the availability and help strengthen the reliability of the system. However, if you're using off-the-shelf hardware devices, boxed up things, and it's a hard drive inside, and you look inside and you go, gee, how come there's so many screws to take apart this box? And they say, well, why'd you take it apart? Well, because I wanted to see what was inside. I'm going to spend like $10,000 for this thing, and you're not even really, they might tell you what's inside, but you kind of still want to see it. So you look inside and you see this IDE hard drive, and you go, well, gee, this is great, IDE hard drive. Let's see, second thing that fails on a PC. Well, power supply is number 1, and hard drives are number 2. So do you want a hard drive in your box? I don't know. Depends on the reliability and availability. If you don't consider that, though, you probably won't know until it's too late. Hardware redundancy, of course, it's quite easy for people to do redundant power supplies in boxes these days, and if you're paying $10,000 for a network device, probably should have one. Of course, Cisco would charge you a lot more than that, but that's okay. We talked about the internet pipe. If the internet pipe goes down, and that's the mechanism by which users are going to get to your box, your VPN probably isn't going to work either. So how reliable is your internet connection? Do you need 2 of them? Do you need VPN boxes that are hosted at different points on the internet so that if one link goes down, you've got a redundant link? Well, that's a possibility. you have to now consider whether the application, the VPN solution that you're going to implement, gives you the ability to fail over. Does it do it on a software client if you're talking about remote user? If it's a branch office device, is it hard-coded to nail up a tunnel to one connection, one endpoint, and that's it? What happens when that goes down? How are you going to get into that box? Can you go in out of band? Or do you need to set up a router with out-of-band management on the router next to it and then set up rules on the router that let you get to your VPN box in order to change its destination endpoint if it's static? Those are all questions you want to consider when you're thinking about availability. And this is, again, a lot of requirement stuff. I hope it's not boring you to death, but it is important to consider. And I guess the reason why I go through all this is because most people don't consider any of this when they're buying equipment. VPN, there's so many VPN vendors. They're hitting you with all this collateral from left and right. One guy says they're better than the next. This is the last stuff you're thinking about when you're just trying to figure out who vendors you should look at, who vendors you should talk to. Also, availability with respect to the individual device. If there's a connection limit on the device, is it software and you can just simply call them up, give them a credit card, plug in a license key and get 200 more? Or is it, a hard limit? Sometimes vendors will say, hey, it handles up to 200 connections. It'll do more, but we don't recommend doing more. Well, I think I would probably prefer that situation if I thought I might be close to operating at that limit, because then I know it's not going to drop or deny that last connection that comes through that 201st connection. It'll let it through. I can set an alarm that says, hey, I've just exceeded my capacity, or I'm at the limit of my capacity, and I need to think about buying another box. Great. So I buy another box. I put it in. Now do I call half my users and say, oh, change the IP address? So how are you doing that? You get into this whole thing of doing round-robin DNS. Someone else gave here a talk on DNS. I didn't have the chance to attend, unfortunately, but I'm sure that they could probably tell you the horror stories associated with using round-robin DNS for pseudo load sharing. It's probably not going to work. Or it's not very safe. It might work, but it's not safe. Also, I guess, since I'm talking about round-robin DNS, and it would be a very, very common implementation to use something like round-robin DNS to do pseudo load sharing if you didn't have it built into the devices. Then the question is, if one device goes down, then half of your connections are going to fail, or at least fail on the first try. So then if the user tries it a second time, they might get in on the next device, they might not. So it's really kind of tenuous. I guess I've seen some political problems associated with VPN. Most of them have just, this typical internal power struggles. Make sure that, you've got the firewall administrator looped into your discussion and your evaluation, so that when you go in and ask him or her to add some rules and help you work with you rather to set up a security policy on the VPN device, particularly if it's sharing the edge of the network with someone else, like a firewall. Work with that person early on. That'll help alleviate some of these problems. You guys all know how to deal with politics. So VPN security, you're probably all wondering, how do you secure VPN, or what do you need to look for? Obviously, you need to look at encryption strength. The type of encryption mechanism is also important. Certain types of encryption schemes like stream ciphers, for example, I think are probably in some implementations, or maybe a better way to word that is that it's easier to implement those incorrectly than it is to implement DES incorrectly. I mean, DES is based on shared secrets. So you share the secret over here, you share the secret over there, or IKE complicates things quite a bit, but you share the secrets on either side, and you now have a tunnel nailed up using shared secrets. So that tends to work fairly well, and it's easy to implement. Things like RC4 and those types of ciphers, we saw some people make some mistakes with their implementation. It wasn't a problem with the cipher, it's just how it was implemented. So I guess I always ask vendors when I'm considering a new VPN device or a device coming out from a vendor, I always ask them, what are you using and how are you using it? And I often ask them, have you had it analyzed by a third party? And they often say, no, we haven't. And I ask them, well, how do you know that, that you're so good that your crypto is implemented perfectly and you're not going to have any problems? And usually they can't answer the question. So I would encourage you to keep asking those questions, and maybe we'll get them to start getting their stuff reviewed by third parties. That way we as customers and consumers can be assured that we're using good stuff. I don't know, there was a rumor about Checkpoint with some sort of backdoor that was about a year ago. Do you all remember that? So, who knows what really happened? I mean, I don't work in the government circles anymore, but, there might have been something, but how do we really know? All it does is raise a big question for us as consumers. What's that?
It's an urban legend. There are two variants on it. One of them, which is like the one you hear a little more often now, is at some major government agency, like NSA, CIA, real high.
Name the three-letter agency.
They have a checkpoint firewall, and you sending all sorts of packets to Israel. So of course, they immediately unplug it, turn it off, dismantle it, and erase the hard drives. You're right.
Sure. So the gentleman up here just shared with me at least a piece of that story, and that goes something to the effect of some three-letter agency of the U.S. government had one of these boxes. All of a sudden, they noticed these packets going out to Israel, wondered what was up, unplugged it, tore it apart, and tried to destroy all the data to make sure that nothing got out. Well, I don't know. Hopefully, as security people, we do our postmortems a little bit better than that because we really want to know what's going on inside the box. With respect to authentication, this becomes very, very difficult as well with VPNs being sort of still, I guess, what I would call in a trial phase. And it's not that there aren't any out there, and it's not that there aren't any that work. It's just that they're all moving so quickly that you get a new rev of code about every week from your vendor. So I consider that a moving target in terms of stability and security. From an authentication standpoint, however, we would love to do per-user authentication, but that kind of really requires a good PKI, and we've got a lot of problems with PKI and that being set and stable. So it's going to probably be a while before we get there. There is Ldap. People are looking forward to being able to use Ldap and solve these types of problems. But as we all know, that there are limited implementations of Ldap today. And certainly not all VPN vendors are providing you Ldap backend. So you can't do it all the time. Per packet authentication, depending on the VPN protocol that you use, like an Ipsec, AH or ESP, you can get some per packet authentication. Usually that involves integrity checking. So again, going back to the slide earlier on NAT, that usually breaks your NAT. So how do you solve that problem? You got to think about that up front. Authorization, again, we talked about authorization, and if you can't pass through to your backend NOS, if you don't have good radius integration, support for radius attributes and so forth, then the ability to integrate into a backend is probably limited. And in that case, you might as well just plan on copying the database over. I think that that's really, really insecure and a very, very difficult way to do anything well because typically you end up, at least if you do that, use some sort of, secure ID type card, some little crypto card authentication scheme on top of any hard-coded passwords. That way, at least you've covered it at least in two bases rather than just relying on static password databases, which all have problems. And I guess the other note about that, which is a given, but that is, how do you change passwords? Suppose you suspect a compromise. Do you call the user on the telephone and give them the new password over the phone? Who's selecting the password for the user? If we could get users to pick good passwords, it's always more secure to let them change it themselves. And the level of back-end authentication is going to depend on how easy that will be for you. Again, I've talked about radius, TACACs, really only found in one brand of router typically, and then proprietary integration with the NOS. This is something else. They may have some sort of proprietary integration with the NOS. I've seen this done before using who knows what they're doing on the wire. That's what concerns me. You have something going on here between your VPN box and your server, whether it's an NT server or a Unix server or something like that. That link is rarely secure. If we use any of the number of topologies that we looked at earlier, chances are that whatever packets are emitted from that VPN server into a trusted network to go authenticate are going to be in the clear, depending on, again, how they've done this. So again, something else to consider when you're looking at authentication and how it's done in a proprietary way. Open standards, usually tend to be a little bit safer just because you know what you're getting. It's kind of the devil you know for the devil you don't. And I would always take the one I know, I suppose. Connection, authenticating each packet. With per packet integrity checking and authentication, can you see this in the back? Hopefully, because if not, I can take a little bit more time to read the bottom line if it's hard to see. But, man-in-the-middle attacks are a concern, and usually using strong integrity checks, particularly with encryption and integrity checks, such as the ones that are used in IPsec, can help prevent man-in-the-middle attacks and other insertion attacks is another one. I mean, insertion attacks aren't necessarily a big problem for hacking your box and getting root, but it's certainly a problem for the user having a smooth experience from start to finish. Typically, the people, well, not typically all, but certainly there's a portion of people out there using VPN clients for remote user access that don't even know what VPN is at all, and they don't care. So, those are the kinds of people that are going to complain and make your life difficult. We talked about, actually, I was just reading through this slide because it's so many words on here, it doesn't need that many words to say that, but we talked about this earlier with respect to authentication and authorization for using different resources. Really look into this because I think, frankly, if you have the time to administer a good authorization schema for your internal resources, that you're probably better protected than if you just rely on some single authentication. The guys, let's see, was anyone looking at the loft crack stuff that they were doing up here earlier? I mean, it's so easy to actually grab just a hash, an NT hash, for example, present that hash to a box and become authenticated on the box. I don't really know that authorizing you for particular resources, if you're relying on that single authentication, gives you any better facility for monitoring this. But if you're doing logging, you can certainly watch the logs and see who's accessing what. And that might give you a clue, especially when it happens between 2 and 4 a.m. Accounting, this is again something that I think you can get out of a radius implementation that most VPN vendors are not doing today. Why they're not doing it? Maybe enough people aren't banging at their door, I'm not sure. But I would demand some sort of accounting for both users and hopefully the types of data that they're using. And that's why I spend so much time presenting to you architectures that employ a firewall in between or something else. I don't care if it's an IDS box or a firewall or something, but something to grab packets, look at them, inspect, and log what's going on the wire. That's where your concerns are. And if they aren't there, they should be there because that's where you're going to have a problem. You know, the chance of someone actually hacking the VPN box, okay, but the chance of someone getting to data on the wire or getting to a box on the other side and sniffing off that box, I think that there's probably a much greater risk there of something going wrong. In terms of policy management, we talked about PKI a little bit. This is wonderful. I can't wait for it, but it's not here, so can't use it today. Triple DES is kind of the standard of the day for domestic authentication. A lot of multinational corporations have problems using things like triple DES, and vendors, this is actually kind of a good point. If a vendor produces a domestic and an exportable version of their gear, which, because we're all using encryption here, most everyone has both versions. If you're a multinational corporation, but the vendor has not necessarily applied for export approval, particularly when you're using 56-bit DES, then even if you're a domestic company with multinational offices, you may not be able to use that solution because it may not be approved by the Bureau of Export Administration. They're the folks that give the rubber stamp. You can do your 56-bit DES across international lines. So you want to talk to the vendor about this if you're in the boat of having offices or people operating remotely from international locations. One of the things that I guess I'd like to stress to you today, since I spent a lot of time talking about requirements and I actually want to convey something useful to you, is that doing a VPN pilot is very difficult. And it takes an extreme amount of time, I think, to actually get a box from a vendor, actually decide what vendor you're going to work with first, and you're probably not going to pilot 5 of these things because it takes so long. Secondly, when you implement one of these boxes in a pilot mode, you typically are doing this on your real production network. Why? Because you've got to test it from the internet. How do you get to your network from the internet? Production network. How do you test whether you're actually going to get through and be able to map up those drives? Production network. So from a hacker standpoint, I mean, if I were a hacker, I'd probably be I'd be looking for boxes that are in pilot mode because they're set up with administrator, no password, things like that, you know, and everyone just wants to see if they work. They don't care about the security yet, they just want to see if they work. Because of course security, especially in a box like this, that's not nicely integrated, is the second step. And it takes a lot of time to massage your security policy and implement it, test it, make sure it works. So the time that it takes to do a pilot is incredible. And we will, I might mention this again too, because I think that really the best thing you could do if you're evaluating VPN purchase for yourself or for your company, or working with someone in your company who is strongly urge them to try to select 1 or 2 vendors from paper, and from telephone conversations clearly, but from paper meaning just a paper analysis, and get the box in that you think is number 1. Run it up in a real test mode to make sure you do due diligence on your security policy there so you're not exposing yourself unnecessarily, probably because it's going to be sitting between your trusted and untrusted networks. Do your diligence there and make sure you've got the right security policy on the box. And then if that box doesn't work, then it's kind of like when you have a business continuity plan, you're going to fail then over to the second solution that you think is the second best fit, and then actually go ahead and pilot that. Because I think that if you are in the position of actually piloting this stuff, you know, there's already a lot of paperwork to do, and you've got to get buy-in from everyone else, and you've got to get sign-off, and all these other cards have to be in place. Well, if you introduce yet more requirements for doing testing alone, it's going to take you a long, long time to find something that's going to work for you. Because the first one probably isn't going to work. But you won't know until the second, you won't know how to select the second one or how to do the second one correctly until you do the first one wrong. Budget is an issue for some people, but the cost of these devices is coming down. I think what's really funny is that some vendors want to license like clients to you for like $100 a piece, which is kind of funny. That's just too expensive. This is just a routing technology, and the price should come down. So I think it will. I think maybe when Windows comes out with an IPsec client on the desktop, I think that the other vendors that are selling IPsec clients will bring the price down a little bit. And we'll probably at the same time, since prices are coming down, see some convergence with how many vendors there are aggregation. Clearly we can't have like 200 vendors. There aren't 200 router vendors that I know of. Anyone else? Yeah. So probably not 200 VPN vendors either. Support and maintenance, most people charge you the typical 10-15% for maintenance. You got to have it. At least most people do. And I guess the point here is just this little mantra, the cheapest isn't necessarily the least expensive in the long run. Too many times I've seen with VPN solutions where you're trying to make a decision based on, is it a $5,000 box or is it a $7,500 box? Well, that has nothing to do with how much this is going to cost you. Yeah, it might be your upfront capital cost, but you can lease that if that's really a problem. But consider all these management problems. Consider whether you can replicate your authentication database or whether you can back into something that's existing. Consider those things because the actual cost of supporting that is going to be much, much greater than any cost differential for capital acquisition. So we talked about piloting the device. It's got to be plugged into the network and working on the production network and ensure that security's in there, all that fun stuff. You want a cross-section of users, get the ones that don't know what they're doing and get some people that can help you out, help you tweak and select the right solution for you. So I have a couple slides here on what I see in the future. I don't want to rant too long, but if you've got questions, go ahead and interject now, or I'll just continue on with these future slides. I got a few of them. I think there are going to be fewer vendors. Again, I don't think 200 vendors can survive selling 3 boxes a year, so we're going to see some consolidation there. And we should, because I think things will stabilize a little bit when people that have all done VPN in different ways come together and learn how can we do this better together as one. Hopefully we'll get some better gear. I think some people are doing OEMs now, which is also helpful. I think that there was recently a deal between one very large router vendor and one relatively small VPN vendor to share some hardware encryption, which is good. There are a couple of other ones out there that are fairly common anyway, and it's not hard for vendors to come by hardware encryption assist if they need it. VPN is done on routers today, and it should be, because again, for no other reason, why not get an IPsec session to your router for management rather than TFTP? I mean, TFTP is kind of unreliable and has clear text and all that other fun stuff. So it'd be kind of easy to IPsec into a router from the internet and change its config rather than go through a bunch of backdoors or out of band. I mean, out of band is probably, in some ways anyway, could be less secure. I mentioned integrated firewalls and VPN, and I think that that's, again, something to really strongly consider. Most firewalls nowadays have integrated VPN. Their implementations, though, tend to be fairly proprietary, and not proprietary in the sense that they're not using IPsec, for example, but you just can't touch and feel it as closely as you can touch and feel a software implementation. So I would encourage you, if you're considering something like that, ask a lot of questions and try to characterize it as best you can so that you feel comfortable with the implementation. But again, I think from a NAT standpoint, and perhaps even from a political standpoint, it might be easier to do VPN there. And actually from an availability, we talked about a lot of other reasons why it might be easier to do VPN at firewalls than in discrete devices. And security gateways, I think that'll play we'll see more security gateways as we move forward and IPsec becomes more ubiquitous, which I think it will. Differentiated services. There's actually, this is actually going to help VPN because you can now differentiate between the type of packet that's coming through a VPN network. So for example, if you're moving mail from your branch office to your home office, does that need to be real time? Does that need to be, is that a user interactive process? No. So if you can flag that packet as a lower end priority packet than something like, mail, pop mail or something like that, which the user's sitting there waiting, watching the status bar, or if you're doing character-based applications like Telnet, certainly it would be nicer to have, or even SSH or anything like that, it would be nice to have some sort of quality or class of service assigned to that so that it comes through faster to you as an interactive user. And QoS, I think we're going to see more QoS implemented. Many of the vendors that I know of and many of the large companies that run large networks internationally are starting to pilot QoS and figure out how to implement it into their into their network. So hopefully we'll see the same carryover of QoS and differentiated services into VPN devices, which again, as we have market aggregation and consolidation, and more router vendors are doing VPN, fewer VPN vendors out there that are independent, they're sharing some of their information. Hopefully we can get some of this working better together. I think another interesting point about VPN, which most people probably think about at some point, is network analysis. How do you sniff packets when they're encrypted? I was doing some testing once with like an RAS server, and RAS has got this really funny packet sniffer that it uses called, like, I don't even know, network sniffer, whatever it is, and it actually gives you the ability of sniffing on virtual interfaces in the box, which is kind of useful if you have RAS or you have VPN, because you can sniff on those interfaces. Well, in one version of this stuff that I got, the sniffer was broken, and when you tried to hook up the virtual interface for the VPN, it broke, or it wouldn't actually sniff it, so you couldn't see your decrypted information, so you couldn't tell if you were getting handshakes through or hellos, and you weren't getting we were actually debugging some OSPF stuff at the time. But the point is that if you can't get into the stream, you can't see what's going on. So if you have problems, whether it's OSPF or QoS or anything else, if it's encrypted and you can't see it, you have a problem. I suppose you could adjust your architecture if you needed to accommodate sniffing, like move the VPN device and the endpoint to some further location, put a sniffer in between. You could do things like that, but you may not get the traffic of interest that way. It just depends. Bottom line is, I would consider how this works with the product or technology that you're thinking about implementing. Some other stuff, I guess, just some pointers. There was a book, I kind of mentioned this in the abstract that I did for Black Hat briefings. I started a book about a year ago and it's still not done. So if it ever gets done, that might be a good resource. There are a couple of others out there now, and a couple decent ones actually. So if you're interested in more information about sort of the how to implement these protocols and what the fields look like, and what the bits and bytes look like, these types of books might be a good resource for that. Tina Bird, who's in the audience here today, thank you for joining us today, Tina. She's got a website up here, as well as a VPN list that she hosts. She gave this to me right before I talked today, so I'm counting on the fact that this is accurate information. But if it's not, my email address is in the abstract in your... It's what? K... Oh, see? There's already a typo up here. Let me change that. For those of you who are copying this down, and by the way, since I didn't get my slides into Black Hat briefings on time, I'm just one of those tardy types of persons, I'll be happy to put this up for FTP or email this to whoever wants it. So please drop me a line. Again, my email address is in the abstract, so leave me a note and I'll be happy to email or put this up for FTP either way. But this VPN list is actually kind of cool because it's gotten a lot more traffic lately than it used to be kind of slow, but now quite a few people are coming up and asking very good questions. And it's also a good place to find information from other people who have implemented the same vendor you're looking at. So it's a good source. And I think that the website here with the FAQ is looking a little bit better these days. And Tina and I have talked numerous times about doing more to sort of bring information together and give it to people who are looking at doing VPN, because it is kind of a difficult field with all these vendors. Where do you start? Hopefully my talk today has given you a little bit better idea about where you can start or what you should think about. If you've got any questions for me, I'd be happy to take them now. Or you can meet me in the hall afterwards. Yes?
Do you have any insight into how QoS might work with VPNs? Because I only have a little bit of understanding of this, but every time that data stream is encrypted, anything QoS that's downstream of the encryption point, it's not going to know what's what.
Yeah, the question really was about how QoS would be implemented within or with VPN. And I don't really have a very good answer to your question because I've seen very few QoS implementations myself. I guess the one thing that I do know is that I have read the drafts on differentiated services and how they're going to use the type of service octet from IPv4, and I think it's called the differentiated services octet from IPv6. And they can copy those flags from the inner header to the outer header if you're doing IPsec encapsulation. And so in that case, you can actually carry the QoS through from the trusted host to the tunnel itself.
So basically that information will be outside of the encryption.
Correct. But as you know, a lot of these, the transport that's typically used is connectionless, and so how a router is going to implement QoS over the internet with respect to connectionless transports, I don't know. I can't answer that question today. It's a great question, and hopefully if you keep up with this website here, Tina and I are the types of people that we would contribute, and also anyone else who brings questions like that get answers, we'd like to put that information up here as well because it's a very good question. Yes?
Just with regard to cost, in case anybody doesn't know, it's going to Windows 2000 and a fairly limited. All I have to say.
Thanks. So, gentleman over here, he must be from Microsoft or knows someone there. Sorry? Not you. You don't. People do have eggs out here. They were saving them for me, but maybe they're going to hit you instead. He says that Quas will be in Win2K. I sort of know that as well. I just hesitated saying anything because you never know what Microsoft is going to do. Yes?
You mentioned PKI being a future technology for VPN. Isn't Pptp out now from that?
Yeah, I mean, Entrust and VeriSign and PGP, they've all got their little models, but the problem is that the models, I'm sorry, the question was, I meant to repeat the question very well. The question was, isn't there actually PKI now for VPN? The answer is yes, there is. But VPN is, even at its current point, it's probably at least a couple years old from being in the mainstream, and we still see so many problems with it. So what do you think you're going to actually run into in production using PKI? Number one, you're going to run into a really high cost because so few people are doing it that they're charging an arm and a leg to get into it, which is great. But the thing is that it's going to change very radically over time, just as IPsec and tunneling protocols. And do you see how many drafts have been written on IPsec just since they gave the RFC numbers? Like another dozen or 2 dozen drafts on policy issues. And actually, this is what I meant by saying the PKI is kind of broken, and that is what's unresolved is how to do policy. And there's really no answer because it can go either way, and it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. So I think, again, you're just going to see an improvement over how it's done in the future, hopefully the near future, like the next year or so. Any other questions from people in the back? I just can't see your hand. Yes? So are you talking about using RIP split horizon exploits? Is that the question? I'm not sure I understand fully the question. Are you asking how can a VPN be used to subvert RIP poison reverse exploits? I don't know. Do you have any ideas? Okay, I don't know. I don't know how that would be used. I mean, most VPN devices don't talk routing protocols. So as far as subverting the VPN system itself, I think that would be pretty unlikely. I think VPN devices, because they're network devices, do need to talk routing protocols, but how that's handled, I don't really necessarily have any good theories myself that I'd like to share with you today. Routers do RIP, so if you're asking about how that would be done in a router, again, I hesitate to try to answer the question. I just don't think I have enough background.
But once you create a trust for some people, like to ensure that that client itself is compromised.
Right.
It is considered, once you go up to layer 5, where you replace the Ipsec to ensure certain ACLs are compliant, is there any way to do something similar with a layer 3 or layer 2 VPN?
So the gentleman made a statement that with a layer 5 VPN, if you replace the TCP IP stack, which is typically not the case, you typically do a shim up at layer 5 instead of at layer 2 or layer 3, you might be able to get some protection up there that might help authenticate the user. And really what we're talking about is good authentication, are we not? Because really what you're trying to do is make sure that that client isn't compromised. And okay, well let me just try to take your question and try to abstract it a little bit. Many people that I've talked to have problems with VPN because you want to give your telecommuter who has this really fat DSL pipe at home access to do VPN at night so they can come in and do email on their time. That's really good for companies because they get productivity increases at home on the employee's time. That's great. So a lot of people want to do that. However, they run into problems because they don't really know how well secured that home network is. They're also concerned about things like if that host gets attacked, then what happens when that host is actually authenticated and they've got a VPN tunnel nailed up? Nailed up isn't actually the precise terminology I should use there, but it's kind of a good term to, metaphor to explain that. What happens is that if you've compromised the host and the host is authenticated and you have a tunnel, then all bets are off. Okay, if you've got the kernel of the host, then you have no way of knowing. I think that's really, in part at least, the answer to part of your question. The PKI that you use is hopefully going to use, or the PKI system that you might someday implement might help you authenticate that user to reduce the risk. But if you have an authentication that occurs, I don't really know that there's an answer. I mean, that's completely outside of the scope of the VPN itself, and it kind of goes into how do you do authentication, how do you do it well, right? Okay, thanks. Yes? Right. So Tina is adding some commentary there that to the effect of some vendors have gone to the extent of being able to give you some granular access or some granular control as an administrator as to what happens at a client. So for example, you might say at a client that once the VPN is turned on and nailed up, that they cut off all the other network interfaces. So that's one way of kind of dealing with the situation and again reducing the risk. But again, my assertion would be that if the client is compromised, then all bets are off. So if you can't control that, then you're taking a risk. And if you choose to do it, then it's just a risk that you've obviously accepted. Questions, anyone else? I'll be available outside afterwards if anyone does have any questions after the fact. And otherwise, thank you very much. Time is up. Thank you.